Hey, and welcome back. In August, I made the trip to my closest music go-round in Milwaukee and stumbled across this 14 by 5.5 Gretsch round badge snare. It had clearly been rewrapped, and the hoops were definitely unoriginal as they were very cheap and flimsy and even showed some weld marks. I could see that this shell was a 3-ply drum, and it looked to be made of mahogany, which I could see since it didn't have the famous silver sealer interior finish, and from my best guess, that places this drum to be from sometime around the 1950s. The snare throw, butt plate, and internal muffler all seemed to work okay, and showed minimal pitting or wear. Since it was only $200, I decided to pick it up and see if I could potentially restore this into something a little bit more to my taste. A couple months later, I finally made the time to get started on this restoration, and it began pretty much like every other project I do, loosening up tension rods in order to remove the hoops and heads. Of course, on the bottom drum, I also had to loosen the straps holding the snare wires in order to remove the hoops and heads, but after I had both heads off, I could begin backing out all the screws holding on the lugs, snare throw, butt plate, and the internal muffler. Oftentimes, I'll use a drill to speed up the process, but on older drums, I'll typically do this all by hand because most likely these screws haven't seen a lot of movement in the last 60 to 70 years, and I don't want to strip or break them by using the force of an electric drill. One thing I absolutely love about working on older Gretsch drums is how easy it is to remove the grommet holding the badge in place. A lot of companies use a grommet that is a total pain to remove, and they usually can't be reused after the fact. But on the older Gretsch drums, they either use a tack where there is no vent hole, or for drums with a vent hole, they use a grommet that has a series of flanges bent over the inside of the shell, where you can get under them and pry them up pretty easy with a razor blade or flathead screwdriver. After you have the flanges bent up, you can carefully push it through with some force of a hammer, and then pry it out from the front with a set of pliers or a screwdriver. If you're careful and take your time, this will do no damage to the badge or the grommet, making it really easy to reinstall later. With the shell now completely stripped of hardware, I could begin removing the wrap. I typically like to use a heat gun to loosen up the adhesive holding it on, but I started by just cutting the adhesive with a razor blade on the wrap seam, and almost immediately, most of it fell right off up till the beginning of the wrap, where it was glued onto the shell. I'd likely go grab my heat gun here and loosen it up, but I could see the wrap coming off nicely with just a little bit of force, so I went ahead and again used my razor blade to help cut the glue while I very slowly and carefully pulled back the wrap from the shell. Again, make sure you take your time here so you don't tear any wood fibers away from the shell, but it's really nothing too tricky. As I got a chance to finally look at the outside of this shell, I was really surprised by what I saw. It seemed that there was some sort of old newspaper fragments adhered to the shell, like paper mache or something. I'm not sure if this was original, or something that had been done by someone else in the past 60 to 70 years since this drum left the factory, but this was truly a first for my eyes. Other than that, the wood was beautiful, and I was sure that with some sanding, I'd be able to refinish this drum in a way that showcases the beauty of this mahogany shell. But before I could get started with any of that, I needed to prep a bit by taping up the holes and bearing edge of this shell to stop any stain from leaking through. And just to be safe, I went ahead and added a whole layer of tape across the interior of the shell, just to be careful with spilling, because I certainly wished I had done it on a few previous projects. The next morning, I took the drum up to my garage to begin the process of refinishing by sanding the shell in order to get a nice, smooth, and consistent surface for the stain to work into. With this shell being so thin, I made sure to be very careful to not take off too much, but I did need to get through that newspaper portion, as well as break down any remaining adhesive, and even out the color a bit, which is pretty evident at the seam of the outer ply of the shell. I worked my way through 150 and 220 grit sandpaper, and after about 10 minutes, I had a nice surface to begin applying stain onto. For the stain, I settled on a color called Honey, because I thought it had a bit more of the red tones that I associate with natural mahogany. After working it in with a brush for a bit, I came back with a rag to remove any excess that hadn't worked into the shell, and then let the drum sit for a few hours before coming back to add a second coat of stain onto the shell. On most of my woodworking projects, I find one coat to really be enough, but in order to get those red tones I spoke of earlier, I felt like I needed a second coat on this drum. Around this time, I also got a delivery for a few parts I'd ordered for this project, including a pair of vintage-style wood hoops and 16 claws. I usually order this stuff from a site like Drum Factory Direct, and I think their prices are pretty fair, but I really lucked out here when I found all of these parts listed on Reverb and picked all of it up for just $65 shipped, which is about what I would have paid for just a single hoop brand new. These hoops were unfinished, so as I went back upstairs to begin clear coating the drum shell, I also brought these hoops up to clear coat them as well. Sure, I could have stained them to match the shell, but I decided I wanted the hoops to have that contrasting look, similar to a lot of the older Gretsch marching snares you'll see from this era. Also, I like how the oil-based polyurethane gives the natural wood a bit of a yellowed tint, so it was very much a one-step process for the hoops. I applied the same semi-gloss clear coat to the shell, and then left all of this to dry for a couple hours before repeating the process another 4 to 5 times, until I had the desired look I was hoping for on the shell. I really like using spray poly because I don't need to deal with brushes and it creates almost no mess. The finish goes on very light and smooth and saves a lot of work sanding between every coat. I did do a light sand with a very high grit sanding sponge at the end in order just to smooth it out a little bit more, but after that, I could take these back downstairs and begin the process of reassembling this drum. After I removed all the tape from the interior of the shell, I could begin putting hardware back on this drum, starting with the badge and grommet. Like I mentioned before, this is super simple to do, bending the flanges back over the shell and tapping them in with the hammer to secure it tightly in place. Next, I added the snare throw-off and butt plate back onto the shell, with just a few screws for both, and then moved on to the internal muffler, which is also just a few screws, along with then threading the adjustment knob in place with the spring and muffling pad. As I moved on to the lugs, I decided to go ahead and add some cotton balls inside each lug, just to cut down on any vibration that the springs might make as I play it. And although I've never noticed it being an issue on this specific drum, it just made sense to do it now, because if it becomes a problem later, I really don't want to have to take all this apart to do it again. Once I had all the lugs back onto the shell and just finger tight, I started to tighten them back with the screwdriver and realized I had a bit of an issue. Due to the wrap now being gone, the thickness of this shell was probably just a few millimeters thinner, but I couldn't get the lugs and screws to secure tightly because it was just enough to allow the threaded receiver of the lugs to stick too far through the shell to allow me to tighten them. I had a few options for how to proceed, but luckily I had a whole stockpile of rubber gaskets that I had purchased by mistake for some other Gretsch style lugs, and so I was able to use them in place here between the lug and the shell, and that thin layer of rubber was enough to allow me to secure these lugs tight to the shell. As I began to rehead the drum, I also found another small issue. The hoop claws that I had gotten were a little too tight to allow me to fit the tension rods through, but I was able to bend them and open them up a bit with a screwdriver, so after I went through and did that for all 16 claws, I could then secure the heads and hoops onto this drum and tune them up. When I bought this drum, it came with brand new heads for both the batter and resonant side, and even though they weren't my usual choice for heads on vintage drums, I liked the combo, so I reused them here. And finally, I added the snare wires back on, using the same wires and red cloth straps they had provided initially, because I thought the red straps added a nice pop of color to this drum. So with this drum now finished, I could take it into the studio and record a few demos for you. I'm using a pretty simple 2-mic setup with a Shure KSM32 for the overhead and an SE Electronics V-Kick on the bass drum. Once the demos play through, I'll come back and give you my final thoughts on this project. I think this drum has a unique flavor to it, and in the mix of all the other fantastic snare drums I already own, it certainly has a place among them. I don't think I'd call on this drum for a pop or funk track, but it has a warm tone that sings in the lower tunings and would be perfect for lighter singer-songwriter music, as well as jazz. It also does that vintage marching rudimental sound pretty well, and maybe this is a drum I'd experiment with a calf head or vintage snare wires. And while I'm speaking about the snare wires, let's talk about this throw-off. Typically, I despise old throw-offs, but I'm usually a fan of this Gretsch micro-sensitive throw, and as much as I like the design and use of it, this 70-year-old model is a bit unreliable, and I noticed that if I'm playing at even a medium dynamic, the throw-off will disengage pretty quickly, making it tricky to depend on for even a single song in a session. I looked into replacing it with the modern micro-sensitive throw because it matches the same hole pattern and it has a locking feature to stop it from slipping, but coming in at right around $100, I really didn't feel like taking that on right now, and instead opted to come up with a DIY solution where I could just wrap a rubber band around the throw and add some tension to the lever to keep it in position. This little hack has worked great, and I can still turn it on and off and rely on it to stay in position. I'm sure there's a few others who have dealt with this issue, so if you have another solution, leave a comment down below. So all in all, for right around $265 all in for this drum and restoration, I think it turned out pretty great. I really love the subtle attack of this drum with the wood hoops, and like I said before, it has a home in my ever-growing collection of snare drums, so I plan on keeping this one for a while. I'd love to hear what you think of this drum, so leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel to stay up to date on future video releases. And until next time, thanks.